Hi everyone, welcome back to The Mystic in the Woods. I'm Kate, and today we're going to talk about my most used decks of 2023 and kind of a casual chat just about how I use my decks in general. So today is the last day of 2023 as I am filming this, and I have the last couple of days spent some time like deep cleaning all of this space. I've redone my desk, my altars are clear, because the time between Christmas and New Year's is always kind of like a weird liminal space for me, even though, the calendar New Year isn't usually a big deal for me. There's still this kind of week here that feels very liminal and very a little bit weird, and I'm starting a bunch of brand new things in January, and so I just wanted kind of like a clean slate. And as I was doing all of that, I was really like moving decks around, reorganizing some decks, and so I was really thinking about the decks that I used the most and how there was a clear pattern with how I was using them, and how there were really some decks that I didn't use like at all this year that I would really like to use in 2024. Would really be a separate video. So anyway, there are kind of three main ways that I've been using my decks this year. So one is in my personal practice, which has been primarily daily draws. I've done some larger spreads for myself, but really it's primarily been daily draws around shadow work, spiritual growth, and integration of those things. And then I've been using, of course, Tarot and Oracle inside of sessions with clients, where I really stepped out of doing one-off tarot readings and into shadow work mentorship and facilitation. And then I also used my decks. I had a few that just basically sat on my desk all year long that I use as I create content, as I create workshops, stuff like that. And while there are like a dozen decks sitting here for my most used, these are not the only decks I used this year, but I was very consistent in using these decks for a lot of the year. So I thought that's what we'd do today. So when it comes to my personal practice, I usually have decks sitting out on the desk, so that is my main altar. I also have like a small table back here, so there's like a little couch and a little table, and so usually my daily draw decks are sitting there. My personal decks are sitting there. I do personal draws and personal daily draws at my desk once my work day starts as well, but my primary like personal decks sit over on the altar space. So in 2023, I did a lot of personal shadow work, a lot of it. And so I started the year in winter 2023 into the spring, was heavy on shadow work, and it was heavy on Goetic Infernals as well. So this is the True Black Tarot, and I talked about this deck in my decks for connecting with masculine energy list, as well as my list for shadow work and working with beings of divine darkness. Primarily, not with all my decks, but for a lot of my decks in my collection, I use them to work with specific beings or specific energies. So this deck, for example, is my Goetic Infernal deck. This is the deck I reach for when I'm working with any one of them. It feels like them to me. It's very clear and to the point. It has this like beautiful like luxury feel to it physically. This is just the deck I've been using for that. So as I stepped into working with Goetic Infernals at the beginning of 2023, this deck came forward to be that deck, and I had really had trouble connecting with it before that. And when I started using it that way, I all of a sudden connected with the deck just fine. So this has been my Goetic Infernal deck that I have been using to work with them. And if you want to learn more about connecting with Goetic Infernals, I have a interview on the channel with Kristen Ramazana, where we talked about Goetic Infernals, demons, parasitic entities, what's the difference, all this stuff, shadow work, manifestation. It was a really great conversation. So you can go back and watch that for more info on the Goetic Infernals. You can also check out the other, I will link all these videos below, the other deck lists where I talk a little bit more about the True Black Tarot. Now, I also was really determined to get to know my Spirit Keepers Tarot this year. So this is the second printing of the Revelations edition. And I cannot remember when this was printed. I don't know if it's on here. I can't remember when I got this copy, but I know I started with my first printing of it, which is a slightly different color palette. There's a different backing, and the cards have a different color tone. And so I started my year with that one. When I got this printing, I switched over to using this one. This was my primary daily draw deck for the first chunk of the year. until my Moonchild Tarot came into my collection, which we'll talk about here in a second. This deck I used for daily draws, and I use it to connect with my guides as a whole. So this feels like speaking to the council of my guides for me. It also feels like the most sacred deck in my collection, in that it requires a certain amount of reverence from me and intention and ceremony. This deck will not humor me if I am quickly pulling cards for just anything, which is not a bad thing to do. I want to make that clear. And I don't do a whole, ceremony every time I pull cards for myself. I don't always meditate or always journal or always make it a thing, right? But this deck, at least for me, really seems to demand that. This deck only wants me to come to it when I am ready to, put on the priestess hat, to sit with it, to be very intentional, and to treat it with reverence. I consider all of my decks to be sacred tools, which would be an interesting video to do as well, just a sacred tools video. But I consider all of my decks to be sacred, even though I can be a little hard on them, physically shuffling and stuff. So when I tell you guys cardstock holds up well, it holds up well. This deck really wants me to carve out time if I'm going to sit and work with it. That has been my experience with the Spirit Keepers Tarot so far. And I do feel like there is a level of depth that I have not come anywhere near with this deck yet. So with that, let me take a sip of tea. My toddler has been sick since Christmas, and I believe I am coming down with whatever he had. So the other deck that I used primarily for daily draws throughout the entire year, other decks as well, but was this one. So this is the Tattered Wings Oracle. I will make sure that the artist's Instagram is below. I believe this deck is out of print right now. I'm really hoping she'll do another run. Mine, I spilled water on it, so it has some water damage. This deck has paired beautifully with my Spirit Keepers Tarot and beautifully with my Moonchild Tarot, the Shadow Edition, which we'll talk about next. In that shadowy realm, I always read with 2 to 4 decks. Even when I'm doing daily draws for myself, I have a whole series on the channel. There's a whole playlist on reading with multiple decks, so you can see how I do that. This deck, so most of them are unlabeled and they're intuitive, and the guidebook, though they are numbered, so there is a number down in the corner, so there is a message in the guidebook, which is always spot on. But there are also a few goddess cards. So the Morrigan is here. I believe Lilith, and there's a third goddess that I can't, Kali is maybe in here. Yeah, I think it's Kali. So I used this deck a lot for daily draws this year. This would have been one of my most consistent decks. So again, these are not all the decks I used. These are the decks that got a lot of heavy use from me over other decks in my collection. So I really love this. I think it was on my standout deck list as well, which I did just a couple weeks ago. Decks, books, witchy things. So I loved it with my Spirit Keepers Tarot. I also loved it with my Moonchild Shadow Edition. Now, I talked about this in my standout deck video as well, because I had the Moonchild Tarot and I wanted to love it so badly. And I just couldn't. I just could not connect with it. So I ended up gifting it. And when this edition, when she started working on this edition, I started to see images. I had really high hopes. I really had high expectations, and I was really hoping I would love it. And I do. It met and exceeded all of my expectations for the deck. I love the color tone. I love the changes that she did make to some of the cards. And this deck very quickly, almost instantly, became my Ashura deck. So this is the deck that I use to work with Ashura. And I talked about that a little bit in my deck standouts as well. And that I said that I wasn't really sure, I couldn't pinpoint why this felt like Ashura to me, but that I said it's both celestial and earthy. And when I quit recording, I realized the reason I said that and felt that at the time when I was verbalizing that was because she is a moon goddess. but she was also worshipped in the trees, in the groves, in the forest. Her name is often translated to groves. So we do actually have accounts of Asherah in the Bible. It was just translated into groves and pretty much actively removed. And so Asherah has come forward as a really powerful guide for me, a really powerful deity for me, and this has been the deck that I have primarily used to connect with her. I have not used this in any client sessions yet. I have not read for friends or family or anyone else with that yet. I was just noticing something on this card I had not noticed before. So far it's been a very personal deck, but it has been very powerful, and I love the guidebook. And I loved the guidebook on the Moonchild Tarot. I just couldn't connect with the deck. So that is the Moonchild Tarot. Now, as we move into, we're going to move into content. Well, let's do this. So let's do this next one. I also heavily for myself used these two decks. So this was the Magical Botanical Oracle and the Witch's Tarot, both of which I believe were on my standout decks video. And I used them together. I have used these two decks in content creation to bring in the shadow aspect into my workshops, into courses, into client sessions, into group containers, etc. So this deck is how I use this to connect with the darker aspects or the darker faces of the sacred feminine. For me, that's generally Lilith, but of course there are like plenty of other faces of the divine feminine as well. So for me, this is kind of a Lilith deck. This is a dark face of the divine feminine. This is a shadow work with the dark face of the sacred feminine, etc. That type of a deck. And I've been really pairing it with the Magical Botanical, which, as I said in my, I think, like top oracles of all time or something, as well as the Divine Darkness deck list, as well as a standout deck list, that this feels like the shadow or the underworld as a whole to me. And I love the guidebook to provide an overall message for the reading and then to tie the tarot into it to get more specifics. It looks beautiful next to the Witch's Tarot by Burning Paper Hearts. It is, I love this deck. I need to redo my I'm gonna do like a top 10 decks of all time list, and I'm also gonna redo my mass market deck list, but I have a few more decks I'm still working with to determine if they would go on that list. So I'm gonna update those coming up in 2024. But I used these two decks for my own shadow work as well as for workshop and content creation for group containers primarily. So then I also used, for the similar types of things, when it comes to connecting with the energy of the Magdalene and the line of the rose, which I taught a workshop, or I created a workshop on earlier in the year. I think we'll be running that again here in 2024. I really like the Modern Hue Tarot by Ritual Planner. This is a Rider-Waite-Smith deck, but it is watercolors and it is an updated color palette, So I actually used this a lot this year for connecting with the Magdalene, for workshop creation. It sat on my desk on and off throughout the entire year. And so these are decks that really did just sit on top of my desk with my desktop altar. I pulled for myself throughout the year. I pulled for content creation throughout the year. I also worked with my wow, words are really hard for me today. My Ember and Aura Tarot for the same thing, to connect with the Magdalene, to connect with the line of the rose, to connect with the Mother Mary, and that whole lineage or that whole wisdom stream, especially as I was creating and working through the workshop, that was very specifically to work with the Magdalene, Tarot, and the Gnostic texts. So Gnostic texts that didn't make it into the Bible, as well as the Gospel of Mary itself, right? So the next few decks we're going to talk about are the ones that I used so often for working with students and clients in one-on-one sessions. So 2023 was the year that I really stepped out of reading tarot for people in one-off type of sessions, and I really stepped into group containers for shadow work and for sacred ceremony and one-on-one programs for shadow work mentorship. And these 3 decks sit on the shelf underneath this desk with a handful of other decks that come forward regularly to work inside of those sessions. But I used these decks so much inside of these sessions that it was really surprising to me. So one is the Shadow of Darkness Oracle cards, the Darkness of Light Tarot, and Woodland Wardens. And I used all 3 of these decks together. So this is the Shadow of Darkness Oracle cards, and I almost never read for myself using this deck this year. I don't know why, I just didn't. There was not a single client session that this deck did not come forward for since I have brought it into my collection. I have used it with every single session since I purchased this deck. The way that my sessions work is the first chunk of it is very much like an intuitive tarot reading. So we're unpacking stuff that comes up in between sessions. We are getting more clarity on the shadow things that are coming up in between sessions, setting intentions to step into the meditation, etc. So during that portion of the session with me, which lasts an hour and a half to 2 hours, I'm drawing cards and we're working through stuff together. Then I guide you into a really deep meditation. So this is the Darkness of Light Tarot that I was using alongside it. This came up on this is one of my favorite tarot decks of all time and is on some of my other deck lists as well. But then during the session, what I'll do is guide you into a deep meditative state. We call forward your guides, and your guides work with you to lead you through your shadow, to see past life memories, current life memories, shadow aspects, unconscious blocks and wounds and all the things. And during that meditation, I am prompting questions for you to ask your guides to gain more clarity on different aspects of what you're seeing. And during that, I'm drawing cards. And I have found that these 3 decks work together very, very powerfully for me here in the 3D to get the clarity that I need to provide you with the correct prompts or the most powerful prompts and questions as we're working through your session. And then, of course, Woodland Wardens is the 3rd deck that I use because I am somebody who almost always reads with 2 to 4 decks. The more decks or cards from different decks I put down on a table, the more the puzzle comes together for me. That's just how I work as a reader, and it's always been that way. The first couple of cards will start to trickle information in, and then as soon as I lay down a 3rd and a 4th card from different decks, boom, I've got the picture. The whole puzzle comes together. So this was the 3rd deck that I used a lot. And of course, if you've been around in Tarot and Oracle for a while, you have seen this deck. It is exceptionally popular for very good reason. And this deck really brings in a lot of clarity, a lot of straight to the point information. If we're trying to unravel animal guides, this can be quite helpful as well. So I used this deck inside of sessions with clients for shadow work facilitation and mentorship. And then the 3rd portion of that session is back to talking about what you saw inside of the meditation, coming up with your homework for the week so that you can have integration and journal prompts and all of that. And again, I use these decks for that. So these 3 decks have gotten a lot of use inside of those sessions. All right, so then the last 2 decks I'm going to talk about, which I probably should have talked about with the other ones, which is fine, is the Nameless One Tarot and Oracle and the, Faceted Garden by Claire Mack. I have been using these decks, again, the second half of the year to really, really work with Eve. So Eve came forward for me again this year as a really powerful guide for healing a lot of wounded feminine. A lot of feminine wounding. And I used this deck a lot to communicate with her in combination with the Faceted Garden Oracle, and I was very surprised at how powerfully these 2 read for me together and how well they connected in with Eve's energy, both for my own work as well as for content creation and the creation of my group container that's starting probably the beginning of February due to some scheduling things, Reclaiming Eve, where we're really going to be diving into the wounded feminine and really doing a lot of deep shadow work and healing that on a very deep level. And Eve is an exceptionally powerful guide to work with for that because her master story includes all the original wounding that women carry. And Of course, none of it's true when we actually look at the scriptures. But the same is held true for Mary Magdalene, right? What we were taught in church is not actually in the scriptures. And the same thing holds true for Eve, is that when we connect in with her, underneath what we've been taught, there's actually a very empowered, strong female character and guide that we can work with for healing on a very deep level. Shame, good girl conditioning, the witch wound, mother wounds especially. And really just helping to dissolve all that shame out. And I was really surprised at the power of these two decks in doing that for myself and in creating this group container that has a whole course in it and deep meditation and one-on-one sessions, and it's a very intensive 90-day container. And these two decks have been the ones that I've gone to the most to create that, in combination with the Witch's Tarot, because I do see and experience Eve and Lilith as two sides of the same coin. Not a situation where we have to combat Eve's story with Lilith's story, but one in which they both contain empowering medicine and healing and just so much depth, especially when we bring those stories back together. So, let's see. I think those were all of them. Those were my most used decks for 2023. Other decks, like I said, did filter in and out. But really this year, these have been my core decks. And I know that it's kind of a lot. Maybe it's like 13 decks or something. But some of them have just sat on my desk all year, taking just short breaks here and there. My personal decks have been sitting on my altar, and those have just swapped out basically between these few. And then, yeah, I have my, the Darkness of Light Tarot, and that came forward for inside of client sessions. And so I've used those a lot for that. So if you have any questions, let me know in the comments. If there's any decks you would like me to do full reviews on here. If you have questions about anything else that came up during this sort of rambly discussion about my most used decks. And if you want any information on Reclaiming Eve, the link is in the description below. We're going to start probably the beginning of February. The live session dates and times will be determined by participants. It's a very small group, 2 to 4 people at most. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out. But yeah, so I hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.